Hello everyone, today we talk about early medieval Florence. Actually, we will extend the chronohistory into the High Middle Ages. We will stop the beginning of the 12th, really. I have already prepared the following chapter for the historical regional series. We have already seen ancient Florence as a prelude, like for these Italian city-states. Later into the Middle Ages, in fact, straightly continuing, in fact, the urban municipal tradition of Roman times. For Florence, of course, this is amplified in importance given the not just the importance of the city later on, but because of the distinctive characters that you can point out already from quite an early era. And yet, Tuscan history, we'll have to talk about this. We haven't talked so much about it. We have also to talk more about southern Italy, which we haven't done enough, definitely. But Tuscan history in particular, within the broader central northern European, say, communal civilization, stems from a sort of more fragmented and to some extent disorderly dimension. At least within the Longobard kingdom, the city fell into the hands of the Longobards in 570. The real center, of course, of the kingdom was the north, the Po Valley, especially the western part. Tuscany was also, especially towards the end of the Longobard independence, directly, as we'll see now, Florence included, under probably the royal administration, but it was somewhat more peripheral. The city districts wouldn't develop, also because of the orography of the region. Tuscany is very hilly, it has mountains, valleys, etc. It's a very complex territory. Would make the development of the various city districts and their, especially in the moment of their fundamental autonomization, much more sort of conflictual, tumultual, imprecise. Like in the Po Valley, you have very neatly outlined spaces, not always so geometric nor sort of say fully symmetric as well. However, Firenze emerges exactly from this complex, at times tumultuous, and also very ambitious municipal background. Talking the Longobards, we do not know too much about the early, the details, right, precisely, of the early settlement in Tuscany, especially in the areas of the hinterland. The most important thing, however, as far as the Tuscan area is concerned, is that the main center of Longobard Tuscia is Lucca, right in the west, close to the Tyrrhenian Sea, at the end of the Arno Valley. Now, to connect the territories that the Longobards had conquered, these Germanic people and its dukes that settled as lords in these various Roman cities had to rely, of course, on roads that, in spite of the decadence of the times, were dramatically developed in this European region. And here we're mostly looking at essentially the Cassia, outer roads connected with its main artery, being still under Byzantine control. And as a result, because of course the Byzantines controlled also an hinterland area that ran, as you know, across the Apennines into central northern Italy, passing from the Tyrrhenian to the Adriatic watershed. And some of these areas, came to be, they were, as a whole, a militarized frontier with the Longobards on the other side. And as a result, the Cisa Pass across the Apennines from Tuscany to Emilia, and thus also the roads that wound through Lucca, Alto Pascio, Fucecchio, and the Elsa Valley, until it headed towards Rome, gained ever more strategic importance. This route would later be known as the Roman road, the Frankish one, the Via Francigena. And this turbulence along the way effectively, in these early centuries of the Middle Ages, cut off Florence from the most important trade route, right? This is just, of course, a temporary situation because eventually, like, the Byzantines would lose those possessions. The Longobards gradually eroded their territory, and this, in fact, allowed Florence to rise in importance, especially, in fact, in the Carolingian era, when that Byzantine presence had been wiped out. Now, perhaps the devotion to Saint John the Baptist, as we've seen also like in the late antique, early Christian period, being Florentine distinction, but also characteristic of newly converted peoples, traces its origins not just to the Roman world, but the same Longobard spirituality that overlapped with it. My second Christian name, by the way, is John the Baptist, specifically. Now, looking at the Longobard period, Florence was, like all the other major centers, under the jurisdiction of a local duke, right? One, as we'll see now, named Guidebrand in the later, also Carolingian period, is particularly remembered. Florence also served, however, towards the later period as well, because as we'll see now, the dukes could be substituted, but still somehow coming back in different ways. Also served as the residence of a gastald, acting as a curtis regia, a royal court, which would have also remained the seat of a count during the Frankish reorganization of Italy. Right, the gastald was essentially a representative of the king, hence the curtis regia. You could appeal to the local tribunal. There was a palace specifically. Longobard Italy was heavily literate and urbanized and bureaucratic compared to other Romano-Germanic kingdoms. So this shows you how fundamentally also the Tuscia had sort of stabilized as a region around these centers, like of course in the rest of the kingdom. Between the end of the 8th and the beginning of the 9th century, after 2 centuries of relative, let's say, darkness, at least in terms of documentary evidence, and maybe of course some contraction from antiquity, the city witnessed the onset of a new revival, marked by some demographic, productive increase and recovery. This phenomenon was present all over Europe, right? This were some of the areas in which the recovery was came earlier, was also faster, and allowed for a strengthening also the urban centers, properly the cornerstone of the local rule. The plaque in front of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Florence commemorates the presence of Charlemagne in the city, and was placed there, however, in the 15th century. Charlemagne did visit Florence at least twice, that we are aware of, in 781 on his return from Rome, and in 786 when he responded to the grievances of certain monks against the aforementioned Longobard Duke Guidebrand, which also shows you how, of course, there was sort of Longobard Frankish overlapping in terms of the local officials and appointments, and how, of course, it was all a establishment sort of fusion to some extent. As you know, later in history, Florence developed a great sense of herself and her past. She developed an historiography, also a mythology of her history, and there was an idea that Charlemagne's stay in Florence would have led to some sort of reconstruction, if not refoundation, which is contentious to say the least, of the city. Right. This was emphasized by ancient chronicler. This is something, I don't know exactly from which author, but you can find it in Villani, for example. It was the idea of our city hosted Charlemagne, and the guy did so much because he was this great hero of Christendom, of humanity. He restored so much, and so our Florence was now blessed by such rejuvenation, let's say. There is no doubt, as we'll see now, that, and this, in this sense, it may be true that from the Carolingian era, Florence started acquiring a greater relevance than Lucca, as we'll see now, as a broader center of culture, of power, and more, right? But this derives from more like the general condition of the Italic kingdom, rather than a refoundation of the city that did not happen, right? There is a plaque honoring Charlemagne's presence also during the laying of the first stone of the Church of the Holy Apostles in the same place. In reality, this new dominance merely entailed submission to a Frankish count instead of a Lombard duke, very, very practically and non-romantically. And it was not until the reign of Lothar I that we can observe a historically confirmed, at least, mark of real revival. In other words, yes, Florence was important, but it's not that Charlemagne in particular witnessed in her like some specific, maybe, I don't know, like he may have contributed, of course, to the development of the city to an important degree, but it's rather, again, the broader harmony of the late Carolingian kingdom of Italy that sort of allowed for this fundamentally central, say also like wide inland city to develop further, like especially with internal communications arising also in the later century, and therefore making her acquire an ever greater political and strategic relevance. And so there is a very positive, in any case, memory left in the Florentine historiography of the Carolingian period, right, which also is associated to the Florentine gradual rise in importance compared to the ancient Fiesole, that, as we've seen, it's just Fiesole today is just still there, a few kilometers from Florence, and so it's been overall, encompassed by the greatness of the grandeur of the Florentine prestigious sort of element within it. However, this was a symbolical deal because Fiesole was the older, if you remember, Etruscan center. Florence sort of developed down river in the lower part, like as a sort of trade hub, and now instead was really affirming itself as the dominant civitas, right? It already was, but dominant in relation to Fiesole. Now, the bishopric of Fiesole, that also in fact had symbolized sort of the ecclesiastical prestige of the older foundation, the one already provided with the sort of sanctuary role since even before Christ, must have served as a cultural hub, in fact. We know that during the Carolingian period, the Fiesolan diocese was governed by the Irishman Donatus, which is a big deal. Saint Donatus will also remain historically a very important figure, like in the local spirituality. This shows you like literally the international character of the Carolingian Renaissance. Here you see the Celtic missionaries that close ties with Italy that had started already since Longobards times, and within the broader process, even if not of conversion in such a country of old Christianization, but interconnection, right, or international relation and local firm organization. In this context of importance increase, and perhaps also as a response to the fear of the Magyar invasions, the Florentine walls were reinforced and extended until they reached the banks of the Arno River itself. This expansion included a triangular strip of land that was now permanently developed, signifying a revival in population growth. Right? It is possible that at this point some raids facilitated also the urbanization of some people from the countryside. Generally speaking, cities were increasing in size, not because people were sort of copulating more, but because, of course, like people were moving from the countryside to the city. These are starting to be tough times with the second invasions to some extent, even though sporadically. In 885, a group of Normans, Vikings, literally rowed up the Arno River. The Arno River is the most important in Tuscany, right? The Tuscan civilization is part of that, and the Vikings were very much into rising up rivers. They would arrive up to the Massif Central, rising up the Loire at Semilia, and so they entered the river at the mouth, and they reached up to an unspecified point. And we know that they plundered the entire territory of Florence and attacked Fiesole as well, right? And by this time, Florence was definitely the most significant center of the mid-Arno Valley. The Vikings succeeded in burning the episcopal palace, right? Quite an offense, of course, to the Christian faith. This is exactly and interestingly the same place where Fiesole's Abbey stands today. For the rest, there wouldn't be some devastating raids that these were episodic, like the Vikings were present in Italy, but only for a few. Then, of course, there are the Normans, but truly they are a different thing. Now, in May of the year 885, the Emperor Lothar I was issuing a very important capitulary in Olona, right, at the royal palace of Corte Olona specifically. This was a very important provision. We'll talk more about the reign of Lothar I. At this point, as you know, in the partitions of the Carolingian kingdom, or at least at this point, specifically just like the succession with, say, the imperial title bestowed to Italy, the Italic kingdom is truly the center also of the imperial dynasty, right? Lothar rules from Pavia, which was the former Longobard capital, and he issues this document that is aimed at reviving the cultural tenor of the land. In fact, Lothar established with this capitulary the imperial schools of the realm. This was incredibly important. And besides Pavia, the capital, as we've seen, Florence also boasted at this point a school of law, rhetoric, and liberal arts, which means that, like in the hierarchy of these centers, actually students from all over Tuscany were administratively reliant for their education on the institution situated in Florence. As we will see better later on, like Florence had, this is maybe a coincidence because, like, say the Renaissance was yet to come, also like humanistic mentality, far from that. But since like the 11th century, we know that Florence had in her city government a department dedicated to the fine arts, right? And something that, if you think about it, sort of mind-blowing because nobody sort of recorded this, and in part it has stemmed from this provision of Lothar I, and still even if there was something more to it that particularly flourished in the city about it. In 854, the districts of Fiesole and Florence, that up to that point had literally pertained to two different cities, were united, right? And so that's how Fiesole came to be part of Florence. Fundamentally, this would have seemed like the ultimate insult in historical perspective, and Florence had, as we'll see, passes a bit for like legitimately, as we've seen, also the city of art, the sort of gentler spirit and more, in fact, lily kind of of spirit. But she tried, especially because we got from Machiavelli the idea of we don't like war too much, we don't like at least to spend for it, whatever. But in the Middle Ages, we will see it, especially in the next episode, it was ruthlessly aggressive, right? It was not a particularly successful center, military speaking. She took, blows from almost everyone, right? And this makes actually Tuscan warfare incredibly interesting. All the Florentine defeats, but otherwise, of course, it was an extremely successful city due to her ambition, her growing importance, also her arms, of course, were there was a significant success, and also military-wise, on different occasions against some rivals. But say it took a while before, Florence could rise really to even just a provincial scale of power. And by the way, at this point, as we've seen, Carolingian times, Florence gets a specific count. So count and bishop, you see the two things had also been united with Fiesole. Under the Ottonians, in the 10th century, Florence kept holding significant political and administrative importance. It was definitely a time which, of course, it was seen at the Florentine takeoff was marked. Of course, this was true because of the aforementioned comital see, given also that this count served as a direct representative of imperial authority at this point in history in opposition to the powerful marquises of Tuscany. I think I have to make a video about medieval Tuscany. As a whole, it's very difficult to do so because of the political fragmentation of it all, but there is a wall in here, and actually the Marquisate of Tuscany, that's what I should make a video on more specifically, was, as you know, one of the many provincial states that existed in Italy after, or during also this, that stemmed from the Carolingian repartitions, and that had tendentially opposed the imperial rule. At least the idea was that the Ottonians would invest mostly and famously in the episcopal governments, and this sort of more feudal, more seigneurial, more sometimes even more rural, even though the Carolingian Italian nobility were really sort of way more urbanized than the others. And exactly for this reason, these guys were trying to consolidate like a provincial statehood, and the Ottonians didn't see this particularly favorably. They wanted a smooth path to Rome, and as we will see now, that this is also all the issue that started with the Canossa later on, also investiture controversy, etc. The Marquises of Tuscany would be quite powerful. They would come to own also land, and that was also the issue of the Matildine possessions later on into the Po Valley, very significant, almost to like the other side, like the Alpine foothills, controlling all these various passes, the Cisa, the Canossa Castle, the crossings at between Mantua and Cremona, like so. That at this point we are in the century of encastellation there, and especially in Italy, that starts at the earliest that in any other part of the West with much heavier infrastructure, like also coming from Roman times, and you find more stone buildings at this point. It's all heavily fortified, and this is a veritable nightmare for anyone who wants to, of course, cross the Alps from Germany and getting to Rome, where of course they were obliged to get their Holy Roman Imperial crown if they wanted it, of course. And needless to say, in a rhetorical sense. But refocusing on Florence, while numerous churches were being constructed in the city and her surroundings, also the monastic activity in Florence commenced to appear. Like initially, of course, with relatively small institutions of, say, relative significance, right? But we find in 978 the foundation of the Florentine abbey by Villa of Tuscany. This was a Benedictine abbey, also serving as a center for cultural radiance, right? So this was a Marcional foundation, by the way. It was really typical of the era, right? It also shows you how, of course, the same Marcians of Tuscany cared about these foundations to have a urban setting, which, of course, reflected the necessity of urban control politically as well, and there were some sort of de facto private foundations because they depended clientelly on the founders. In the meantime, Villa's son was Hugh of Tuscany, or Tuscia as it was also called, achieved another crucial milestone for Florence. That is to say, having been chosen as the residence of the Margravate of Tuscany itself, the city would now seek retribution against Lucca, which had until then been the political capital of the region, as we've seen. This had already started happening, and there would be historically like a great rivalry between all these Tuscan cities that hated each other for some reason. This is also interesting in an early medieval perspective because Lucca was particularly, so at least it has this enormous, strictly historical legacy in the enormous. Actually, I think it's the largest archive in all early medieval Western Europe, right? The other cities, including Pavia, with all the royal archive, etc., went destroyed by Magyar raids and etc. Total disasters for the history of mankind to a scale that we can't even fathom. Lucca instead has a massive documentation, sort of puts it on the foreground at the center. So many interesting developments in this Tuscan reality. We'll surely make some videos about that, and I will also make a video about Lucca, of course. Now I'm covering Florence because, like, I couldn't go on, at any other time after 5 years of Schwerpunkt without talking about Florence a bit more in depth. And but these other Tuscan cities were also important on their own, and also like in the measure in which they were subjugated by Florence sooner or later, so that other than just being great centers, right, of escalatingly scalar output in the history of Western civilization, they also are required in historically speaking, to understand the history of one another, and this is especially true for Tuscan. Now, the Ottonian immunities were granted to the same Florentine bishops. The donations contributed to the vast ecclesiastical property, and the monastic foundations established in Florence opened, so altogether in this broader competition between lay and ecclesiastical power, a historical period that borders on legend, almost, illuminating even the shadows of urban life with their beacons of light happening at the time. We do not have a too detailed picture of such organization for Florence. We know of some figures from the feudal and ecclesiastical realms who step fully into spotlight, however. Among them are, of course, the Marquises of Tuscany, but also the simoniacal bishops, and the reforming monks. Right, Tuscany would be key to the prodrome to the Gregorian reforms. Great part of the, just think about Hildebrand of Solana, Peter Damian, like we have at least figures operating exactly in this context. We'll see now, especially John Walbert, even when coming from other cities, because of the increasing of other regions, because of the increasing centrality of the connection with France, for example, not just with Germany through the imperial tie, but the spread of congregations, over sort of this need, this broader spirit of reform. The Tuscans were quite receptive for this, and so the spirit of these urbanly, say, developing and popularly thriving centers is reflected politically, ecclesiastically, also in the struggle, like in something that is connected also with the Pataria that we have observed most, like of course having its greater developments in Milan. That was the most important city in the kingdom by now. We talk about that in the videos about Milan, and you can check all the Gregorian reforms, like sort of ecclesiastical history, what the simony, the Pataria, like all the incredible issues that were rising at that point. And Florence essentially exploited them to rise towards what would have eventually become the commune. We are in the age of Matilda of Canossa. We are in this very interesting time, I would say, in Italic history, in which you have still this feudal powers that are witnessing, however, the relentless rise of cities that would eventually take their place, as also much of the rural nobility would urbanize and actually take part in the communal foundation as consuls, and something that we will see better in the next video. Now, the relationship between the Marquisate of Tuscany and the Holy Roman Empire as a whole reflects broader historical currents in the Chronicle of Florence. The struggle against simony lends considerable resonance to local episodes, positioning them as precursors to ecclesiastical reform and the investiture controversy. Villa, Hugh, that we mentioned, also the two Bonifaces of Tuscany, the Countesses, Beatrice, and Matilda encapsulate, through the mere mention of their names, the history of the Marquisate, linking the, if you want, the Romano-Germanic era, the early medieval memories, to the communal period, the great Italian civilization of the later Middle Ages. Similarly, figures such as Romuald, Tausus of Badia, we will see them now, John Walbert, Peter Igneus, embody that spirit of Florentine, sometimes radical asceticism, which heralded a new life in the first century following the year 1000, and the awakening of civic consciousness invigorated by religious fervor and aspirations for liberty. Right? As you know, the ferments of the religious reform, of the issues of purification of the church, all stemmed from the idea that there had been under the Ottonian era an excessive imperial and therefore temporal interference in ecclesiastical affairs that corresponded to the appointment of some, at least imperially chosen individuals that were felt like some external poems imposed on the cities. Right, there is almost a proto-Guelph Ghibelline sense to that. Definitely an investiture controversy. That is what starts, even though those names pertain to a slightly different period and sort of exception. Now, amidst this assembly, first appearing in Vallombrosan geographical biography, are the prominent figures of the reform movement, drawn by events within the Florentine milieu. We're talking about other names, Popes Victor II, Stephen IX, and Nicholas II, Alexander II. So we're talking about probably the center of the reform. Saint Peter Damian, I made a video about him if you're interested also in Vallombrosa and in all the both ascetical, mystical, like spiritual achievements, but also like the very strictly practical, juridical, judicial, like public ones that took place exactly in these centers, illustrating how radically interconnected in this, highly, say, very civilly advanced context, also, of course, the religious, the spiritual beliefs and forces really were. However, it is worthwhile to take a closer look also at the flourishing century spanning from the Marcian Hugh to Countess Matilda's death, the Florentine Abbey of St. Michael in Martury, and the Camaldoli Hermitage, I talked about that too in a video, stand, of course, among the great monastic foundations that testify around the turn of the millennium not only to the zeal of a remarkable hermit from Romagna that is just across the Apennines. Florence is very close to that. And so, as we'll see also historically, militarily, like very much later on during the intercommunal wars, Saint Romuald, but also the generosity of the early Marquises of Tuscany, as we've seen, Villa, and her son Hugh, right? A Florentine illustrious child, Dante Alighieri, recalls Hugh, especially in his, say, historiographical memory, as the great baron, which for a late 13th, early 14th century Florentine meant really a lot, because the barons were really understood as it's true full-blooded noblemen, and people that incarnated that real power. That this existed also in a very sort of more, say, lay, civil, urban reality, like the one of Florence at the time. Think about Corso Donati was called like the great baron as well, in Dante's time. And so there was this pride attached to these figures that, even though like seen as a bit, tyrannical, and or at least, in Dante's time, those who could simply seize power against the interests of the major clans, in a monarchic sense, were the pride of the city, like a city that could express so much in terms of nobility, power, etc., and were always appreciated. And at least Hugh was connected to Florence in that Marcional, say, Tuscan Marcional dimension, which takes on even a more sort of imposing character. Also, Minos from Fiesole immortalizes Villa in a monument at the same abbey founded by her. Minos from Fiesole is a later, 15th century author. The Marquisate under the first Boniface of Tuscany responded to these acts of generosity, new monastic foundations, of which the city profited, and so would have been more closer to the marginal power. However, the mystical tendencies, like backing, like sort of a greater popular autonomy from this higher power, ultimately regained prominence, harmonizing with this sort of emerging quasi-humanistic spirit after Boniface's death. Right, we will have to talk about this at some point also in history of philosophy. It was a 12th century Renaissance, and at least we underestimate how much also the later Renaissance was a continuation of some broader movement and awareness of, say, civil liberty and cultural sort of superiority, very connected with the urban spirit, and that in centers like Florence at the time was already very much sort of there, right? We tend to imagine it as a novelty within a dark and gloomy Middle Ages. In many ways, this had simply continued straight through like early medieval times, especially in the Italian case of these very Roman cities, and would have not even seemed that much of a novelty. Now, of course, like it was radically different throughout the eras, but I mean, at least the primigenial spring of that, like we was seen like traditionally in pretty clear fashion. Now, at the dawn of the new millennium, a marble basilica dedicated to Saint Miniatus arose on the hill believed to have been sanctified by the Christian martyr back in antiquity. We've seen the story in the video about ancient Florence. This basilica was consecrated in 1013 in the presence of the Bishop Alibrand and with the approval of the same Emperor Henry II. Symbolizing a promising future for the city below, because of course, like this meant at the time, like that the city would take some positions that you see are not that simply outlineable. Right here, the city wanted to escape a bit, like the maybe the marginal power and sort of receiving the imperial support. Henry II was not sort of the most active guy in Italy, but he had to come there, and because of all the rebellions, also of the Italic monarchs that had been elected, in fact, in this continuity with the Ottonian power representing that, in fact, feudality that we're just talking about here now, that the cities would have not been particularly happy to, in fact, receive. And so here the emperor pursues a bit like, here's Henry II, the quarrelsome, the Bavarian fundamentally, and he would still pursue the policy of his, say, Ottonian, the C's Ottonian family branch by betting on the city and, of course, on a just temporary presence in Italy at that point. Now, this Florentine foundation is very important. The church, with its luminous round arches, Corinthian capitals, and exquisite facade of white and green marble, along with the adjoining monastery, represented a zenith of Romanesque style in Tuscany. Remember what we said about the Florentines already developing their own fine art department in their urban government. Well, this church, more or less around that time, features the initial signs of that very sort of proto-Renaissance we're just hinting at, that would encourage further the revival of classical elements that in perspective is definitely the foundational to the future development of Florentine art as we know it, like in the later medieval period. Florence would soon grapple with the implications of the Marquis' and Rainer's deposition for opposing the new Emperor Conrad II. The Salian made a bit about his life and times, which went along with the transfer of the Margraviate to the powerful Canossian family, which would quickly rebel in turn against the empire, which tells you again how interestingly sort of obvious the dynamic was. These were a feudal clan appointed by the Holy Roman Emperor that hoped like for this rivals of the former family in charge, like to simply being more loyal to the empire, and instead immediately began to autonomize. It shows you also how alive feudal institutions still at this point were in Italy, and actually, and paradoxically, in a country like Tuscany, that was that would be sort of, at least in later history, recognized for its more popular anti-feudal character, but actually it was sort of politically, institutionally backwards here compared, for example, to Lombardy, that would have a much more sort of say, urban rejection of feudal power at this point compared to Tuscany, and it still had this important marginal power. As a result, the Florentines had to acclimate themselves to the precarious nature of marquisal jurisdiction, while seeking opportunities for liberty amidst feudal conflicts. There was a public nature of this feudal authority, just like in the wake of the best Carolingian tradition. The margraves were truly like the responsible on behalf of the emperor, as we've seen, that had appointed them, regardless of their loyalty, to rule over Tuscany. And then down the line, you had the counts, and you had the bishops, and you have, as you understand now properly, the people, the citizens of the cities that are rising in importance. And so, on one side, like the general population was, of course, happy when there was some sort of strong power capable of bringing order, like in time of trouble. Here we're skipping like all the sort of broader issues, the wars, the expeditions, the campaigns, etc. But of course, it was a functional government. There was also a space for being recognized in their civil instances as well. At the same time, the conflicts that constantly existed also between like all the various noblemen, there were the Canossas here, for example. They weren't just ruling over, say, owning the margravial title and being incredibly powerful, having territories beyond Tuscany, as we'll see in the north, in the south. But naturally were other noble houses, and we will see actually how a great part of Florentine history later on in communal times was to sort of tame them, like those who had remained, especially in the Apenninic hinterland, and or like just in the city district, because they had existed. They were a part of that world, and it was rather the commune to be something new, right? Now, the authority of the margraves, of course, was sort of destined to diminish even further when Henry III, Holy Roman Emperor, took Beatrice and her daughter Matilda hostage to Germany. We'll never made a video about Matilda of Canossa, but she's very interesting, as you know. Many of you are into her because of video games, but of course, like, you know, she's a major figure in this time in history, really, of European scale, because of essentially of the investiture controversy in this broader dynastic events within the houses of the Salians and the entire imperial policy. This kidnapping had occurred in retaliation for the actions of Godfrey of Lorraine, that was Beatrice's second husband. The status of the two women, Beatrice and Matilda, was then contested by Pope Victor II during a council that he held, especially in Florence, right, in the presence of the same Emperor III. Of course, this was, of course, like mirroring like the margravial Tuscan nature of the deal, the increasing relevance that the Frankish road was becoming really for everybody involved. And so how crucial these centers and their stability was for the one of the empire and the relation with the papacy as well. And on this occasion, you can understand like a city hosting a pope and an emperor would be benefited in general by many say traffics and earnings and income. For example, it's on this occasion that the Church of Saint Felicita and the one of Saint Reparata were adorned, right? The council held in Florence condemned the practices of simony and clerical concubinage that were at this point like a punchline against the Holy Roman Emperors, inspired by the Reform movement championed by the founder of the Vallombrosan monks, Saint John Walbert, that as we've seen, had been so close, so connected with Florence, with Tuscany as well. So this was ever more important locally, because as we observed, right, all these popes were deeply connected themselves with Tuscany, and this sort of more, if you want, even a radical, sometimes even a fanatic mysticism and the deep conviction of the independence of the papacy. It wasn't just something emerging from this background, it was also much greater sort of international, universal clothing to the spirit. But as we've seen, there was a great, in fact, international, European-wide interconnection of these issues that these individuals felt very deeply from both, say, the dimensions of the local, the international one. Once the marginal government of Beatrice and Matilda as heiresses to it was restored, religious unrest ensued. This had been provoked by the simony of the bishop Peter Halfbeard, igniting the ascetic zeal of Theodosius of Badia and Saint John Walbert. Right, Bishop Peter Halfbeard was like a simoniac. He sort of had this broader involvement politically on the imperial side, and this unrest occurring in Tuscany was quite upsetting. Florence was quite central to it, and the Pope, as a consequence, decided to seek pacification through the advice of Saint Peter Damian, which ultimately led to the trial by fire in 1068. This tells you also how the spirit of the Gregorian reforms was still permeated truly with the most, let's say, the most genuine, the most convinced, most honest conviction of the doctrine of the two natures that we were talking about the other day. The idea that, like, if somebody was truly virtuous, say the laws of physics would bend to such justice, right? And these weren't, let's say, superstitiously narrow-minded realities. Were the biggest ones existing at the time. And this judgment was, of course, desired by the people to determine God's verdict between the contending parties, showing how the public involvement into such righteousness was so felt. And the trial by fire, supported by the so-called Peter Innius, because that's like where the name stems from, compelled the simoniacal bishop Peter Halfbeard to resign on the same occasion. Religious fervor surged with the intensity of such battles in Florence, which at the dawn of the communal era seemed to have become a bastion of the Gregorian reforms, per se. Like before becoming a reforming pope, by the way, the Florentine bishop Nicholas II had opened the way for the same Hildebrand of Solana, Gregory VII. That's how deeply Florentine this part of the reform really is, and truly very Tuscan in nature. The humble church of the Vallombrosan Hermitage, where Saint John Walbert prepared himself for the struggle against the simoniac, had been solemnly consecrated at this point by Rudolf of Paderborn, a former monk of Cluny that, as you know, had backed substantially the same church reforms, and that in this case, as an international figure of great prestige, appeared to bridge the Tuscan movement with the same French and German reformations, right? It was a European-wide phenomenon. However, in the most sensational episode of this conflict, as we've seen, being the trial by fire, triumphantly won by Peter Innius, we are particularly interested in the testimonies that reveal the same, say, the fanaticism of the same people, like a population that, while still sort of indistinguished, popularly speaking, was beginning to develop an awareness of their entity and significance against the backdrop of feudal and ecclesiastical society. Of course, the Florentine populace would have been importantly stratified, as we've seen. They were, like, it was typical of the place. They were particularly literate. There were different, say, activities next to, like, the agriculture and industry. That was some bureaucratic activity, especially around the episcopal government, but also the margravial one. As we've seen, some artistic vein, and further, like, these are the times of great juridical development. Tuscany is also at some point like the vehicle of much of the true, at least the coastal towns that, however, would bring their treasures also to the hinterland, of also the recovery of Roman law through the Byzantine manuscripts that were imported in the West for that purpose. And it's no surprise that these Florentines wanted to know, they cared about their salvation. They wanted their soul to be taken care of adequately, and they wanted to intervene politically, what seemed to them to deprive them of such dimension. Of course, there were lots of very, say, practical sort of interests connected with all this. It was about the urban, the municipal liberty that these guys were fighting for. Its autonomization, the possibility of spending all these potential into the construction of a districtual power. Indeed, an appeal to Pope Alexander II was drawn up in the name of the clergy and the Florentine people, specifically, while St. Peter Damian, which was, again, a man of utterly insane culture, politically, juridically, other than just ecclesiologically, directed his letters to them as, quote, cives Florentini, that is to say, of course, Florentine citizens, right? And remember what citizen means here. These people were free men in arms. They were people that, in the best Romano-Germanic tradition, had remained untamed in these great municipal centers, saying, we are free, and together with that, we bear some degree of nobility morally that allows us to bear arms, to self-determine ourselves, and to fight for our own liberty. A few years prior, the Marquian Godfrey of Lorraine had chosen Florence as his capital for this very reason, like the importance that Florence had achieved. And from 1059 to 1061, at the beginning, essentially, of the Reform, for the first time, a Florentine bishop ascended to the throne of St. Peter. Gerard of Burgundy, so close to Cluny, of course, who became Pope Nicholas II. You see how many not real coincidences, like the Florence was becoming like a gateway to the same papal milieu. This is not something that continues in Florentine history. It would be, of course, other famous Florentine popes. Think about the Medici ones in the Renaissance, but it's not like a continuous thing. It's this very specific time of the beginning of the Gregorian reforms and the investiture controversy that sees Florence so protagonistic because of the forces that were agitating within her. And that, in, say, comparing, say, the Tuscan situation to the Lombard one, in fact, put her in parallel to Milan, all right, respective environments. Like, once the local dispute, as we've seen, like, had been resolved, like the one between the Half-Beard and the Innus, and with the, in fact, great Valombrosan agitator having vanished from the world stage, the peaceful government of Tuscany was left in the hands of the last of the Canossians. I can't stress enough how powerful this house really was, politically, strategically, dynastically. The struggle for investitures had erupted exactly at this point on a larger scale, with Matilda of Canossa emerging as the most formidable champion of the papal cause. Of course, it's all more complex than that. That initially she was actually siding with the imperial direction, but she quite soon sort of understood what potential the Tuscan Margravate had at this point, and it is well known how the conflict between the two supreme powers contributed to the advancement of communal autonomy, which mobilized and exhausted the entire feudal world, both lay and ecclesiastical. So we're looking at the time actually of sunset of this the Margravate that is illustrated by the same Matilda's existential reality that's quite sort of bitter overall. Put it in perspective in just chronological for how fast, after all, the old order was vanishing. And of course, just like the Lombard ones, albeit say more slowly, Tuscan cities began to achieve their first forms of autonomy. We are in the second half of the 11th century, at the end of the century, the beginning of the 12th, as we will see now, like the Italian communes are properly born with the foundation, or at least the documentation, that's our historiographical convention of the consular institution, the consular regime. However, of course, this occurred at varying paces in the previous generations without, let's say, the clear establishment of the early consular regime. Again, in the next video, we will talk only about the 12th century. We'll see better how it really worked. Now, the situation of those cities that had rebelled against Matilda in support of the emperor subsequently received solemn concessions of franchises from the supreme authority, in fact, of the empire as a reward. Right, this is paradoxical because later on it would be the communes, generally speaking, going against the emperors, trying to represent some control. So what we're witnessing here is rather the evaporation of the Italian feudal potentates, at the principalities, at least like the feudal presence would always continue in the peninsula, in the imperial hierarchy, etc. But of course, the centrality of the communes would subordinate it to their policies, and this is quite interesting. And already at this point, you start seeing some rivalry between the Tuscan cities in this regard. For example, the liberties of Pisa and Lucca were established at the same point with an official diploma and preceded by legitimate investiture before the Florentine ones, right? And the reason in this case was that Florence had remained loyal to the church and to Matilda of Canossa instead. This brought two different consequences. First of all, you understand that in this context, the imperial, the papal, and the marginal powers were essentially investing. Now they were betting themselves on the cities. They were co-opting them at a higher level of power. They were factionalizing them. Right here, you see Pisa and Lucca are actually in contrast with one another. We've seen it in the video about Pisa, like they were neighbors that sort of hated each other. Pisa had a more maritime vocation. Lucca was sort of more. But you see, that was this competition, in fact, these lower Arno cities and the middle Arno one, that was Florence, that depended naturally on the Arno traffic, also on these cities at the mouth of the Seine River. You understand unironically how, like, these other universal regional powers tended to look at the cities and realize that they were a bit like the future to invest in, and how Florence specifically was supported essentially at this point both by the margraves of of Tuscany and the papacy. This means a lot, right? Especially considering that the Canossas, as we were saying before, were bolstering the control lines of, in fact, of that road that descended right from the Cisa Pass and through in fact also like the Florentine routes, and therefore like trying to become also like more strictly like continental force, or at least maintaining that, while also some more maritime power was emerging, as we've seen from also other Tuscan centers. Florence was chosen for this, and you understand the prestige the city acquires, even just spiritually, morally, like how the Florentines could have been feeling at this point, being flattered, being honored by such position. Florence, as a consequence, would not participate in the shifting dynamics that elsewhere led to the decline of the margravial jurisdiction that were really serious, right? The system, as we were saying, was eroding, paradoxically also thanks to Florence, that still participated in the model of sort of municipal liberty, that in fact was developing further. This is true for Florence, even though not so fast, in part also for this reason in comparison to Pisa, right? And it does depend exactly on this greater, you see, feudal dependence. Florence was more protected by the Margrave, so what was the point of pushing too far, for example, the communal direction, like establishing the consuls earlier in time? Pisa, conversely, was a much more emancipated city. They also had like an incredible sense of Romanity, and they were projected towards the sea. They were starting to be more autonomous because nobody could simply blockade such a coastal center, and that's also why the emperors that later needed to also go towards southern Italy and contrasting the Normans began to let's say to invest, especially in this maritime republic, especially Genoa, Pisa, etc. That would remain Ghibelline. Florence would remain Guelph, for example, historically. So you start seeing already this kind of dynamics emerging, right? They wouldn't always be from just this side or the other. Again, in the video about medieval Pisa, we actually saw this very clearly. Like these cities were essentially pursuing no other interest but their own, right? But it's still very fascinating to see that, I don't know, in the time of, for example, this imperial and Canossan struggle, like there were already the Normans established, well established in southern Italy, in Sicily, right? So it's actually already a very advanced time. That's why we have to talk about Matilda specifically, because her life really highlights all this contrast, this paradox, if you want. Meanwhile, by the way, these cities already hated each other. Let's point that out. Never forget this. This is incredibly important for understanding the Italian Middle Ages and their sense of being, like of identity. Florence, as we just said, was subtly adapting to such new context, fully aligning herself with Matilda's Guelphism. She supported the papacy. You understand how this played out also in the Holy Roman Imperial axis. Thus, under the benevolent governance of the last Marquess at this point of Tuscany, Matilda would be. Her inheritance would become, by the way, an object of major contention throughout like papal imperial history, and like in the following couple of centuries, basically all the wars that were fought were over her inheritance, and that's also how overwhelmingly powerful and rich she was. But in this sense perspective, how overwhelmingly powerful and rich the cities were altogether, more than this margravial system. Indeed, this final period of the Marquisate, the Margraviate, marks the beginning of the Florentine autonomy, not only due to the reasonable hypothesis that, of course, Matilda sought to reconcile the citizenship in a manner similar to what the emperor practiced with the peasants, but also because there is credible evidence of the involvement of the most experienced among the cives, the citizens, in one of the most crucial branches of public power. That was the administration of justice. The names of those boni homines, used to say good men, intended truly in a legal sort of sense as trustworthy, as, honest people, that appear in the Matildine Placeti, for example. So these documents that simply said placet, so that, when the authority was giving green light for the provision, already represents an elite within the citizenship. Right? Remember that the Italian communes are born from out of actually a very aristocratic background, and that would in fact soon evolve into the ruling establishment in the consular regime. Right? These were milites, actually, were knights. All right, and they were enforcers for the same margravial authority in many ways, and here we're just called to testify in favor of these provisions during the tribunals for settling controversies, etc. Right. It's important to stress that Tuscany would develop a great legal culture a bit later on compared to this time, but let's say it was an enormous part of the population that, for example, practiced the notary profession. Right, later on. We're talking about disproportionate amount, like in some areas at least. There are some interesting studies showing that this was so profitable because there were so many transactions, there was so much sort of civil development that these people were needed like crazy to make the system work and keep it oiled. Now, another training ground for this emerging leadership, however, that was, as we said, essentially a military class, was the episcopal curia. During the vacancy, right, where members of the laity administered its assets under the title of vice domini. This is incredibly important because it happened also in other Italian communes. Essentially, there was not really in the public sphere any other authority that the commune could simply substitute itself to. So they invented this, overall it was sort of further developed in legally and institutionally, the idea that they were essentially operating on behalf of the local bishop count. And so if, say, a bishop was not re-elected for some reason amidst all these incredible issues, here there are wars, right, between, this is the time, in fact, of Henry IV, Gregory VII, Matilda in between mediating, and in this very lands, right, so like it was a pretty messed up situation. Like these knights were also to respond for the goods like of the local church, of the local, as you understand here, some sort of proto-communal regime that was already taking shape, in spite of the deference of these men towards the Marquess, who essentially protected them to the point of not really seeing her humiliated by simply like the final takeover of a communal authority. So as we've seen, if the work of St. John Walbert had marked an initial setback for the corrupt clergy, the whole issue, as we notice now with all these ecclesiastical perturbances, had still not been resolved. Across the peninsula, groups of commoners, traditionally from the lower estates, but not exclusively, began to form, rebelling against the authority of the clergy. This movement came to be known as the Pataria. Now, we don't explain the etymology, made multiple videos about the topic. And these people were sort of very heterodox, right? There was something even heretical about them. It's a bit like the pauperistic evangelic movements in the following century that sort of were borderline orthodox and they at times produced, in fact, heretics, and were really uncontrollable. Like, this was the point. Like, the spread, this happened in more advanced areas of Europe, like central northern Italy, southern France, the Rhineland. All right, that's where these ideas spread, for different reasons that are mostly political in nature. Like, they're not really much ideological per se or doctrinal. Like, it would never be like even a heresy, like developing a fully fledged like doctrine that would be shared by everybody. But they were essentially backing the local, let's say, nascent communal force against the imperial imposition of bishop counts, as we were looking at before. So it becomes an early sort of Guelph versus Ghibellines thing, because the papacy perfectly knows that people are, in general, like, from the lower estates, they're sort of crazy, they're violent and heterodox, etc. But if they serve the function of leaving, say, giving more breadth to the papal influence in Italy and keeping the emperor out, of course they are to be rewarded. They're the useful idiots that also allow the milites of these cities to take over control and to start managing the commune. Sometimes also the church, like, at least, with bishops that were a bit more like the expression of the local communities rather than imperially appointed. As far as Florence is concerned, at least as long as Countess Matilda was alive, Margaret, actually, at least she was Countess as well of Canossa. That's what you can't hear the other name. That was the ancestral possession. Terrific place, by the way. If you see, I think I inserted here some of the pictures. Even though it's not in Tuscany, she maintained the balance of power across the peninsula, factually from Piedmont to Latium, and she acted as a mediatrix between opposing interests. In Florence, she had, for example, a castle just outside the city walls. This is very sort of significant, ideologically speaking. Like, I'm the Marquess of Tuscany. Like, Florence is my faithful city. I have a castle just outside the city walls. I don't step into the city as, as a, say, seigneurial imposition, like, but I stay near, right? And this castle was located, by the way, near the church of St. Lawrence as well. Matilda's occasional presence in the castle was sufficient to quell the Florentine rivalries. That's how authoritative and sort of morally impacting this woman was. Right, she was a great politician. She passed away in 1115, which means, actually, that, as we'll see now, that at that point Florence really breaks loose. Like, she starts systematically taming the remnants of the nobility, right? That at this point had not been able to reconstitute, say, a margravial power, and that therefore also would create much greater damage, like, to the entire surroundings, because they would start fighting essentially against each other and also against the interests of the cities, right? And this is also a moment of reinforcement of Florence, or urbanistically. The city walls, for example, are reinforced at this time. There is an outpost on the river, the Altafronte Castle, constructed during this period. And that's where the feudal conflicts again start really involving Florence in a very intimate way. Like, you see, what is interesting really about different areas of Italy, and we will hopefully see it in some other videos, that is the survival of a feudal presence in the countryside, in the hinterland areas, right, in the Apennine. And Florence is very close to the Apennines, and there is this sort of, in fact, more feudal, rural, encapsulated dimension in which these men sort of this dynasty survive over the centuries, and they also would produce later famous soldiers of fortune, very important commanders that at some point were called properly to command the Italian communal armies of including the Tuscan ones, the case of the Montefeltro, for example, from Romagna and into the reforming the peasant military, something we have seen in often, and it's a major chapter. Many condottieri, even later on, right, they sort of just die out, and they're a bit like more, say, martial, right, violent, crazy, and the communal forces basically had to stamp them, right, in their original prerogatives. Yeah, this is a bit overlooked, like how much these people felt entitled to their rights of noblemen that dated to. These were all like noblemen of, I don't know, Lombard, Frankish, also more recent origin. Some were just more like locally emerging. This is especially the case for Tuscany, especially in the cities. Lombardy has a stronger nobility, has greater lords, right? People that will never actually allow, for example, the people to govern fully, right? There are popular seigneuries, but there's never like the popular regime later on. The idea of pride, the idea of, again, who the hell are these citizens compared to us, like in a higher perspective? Very brutal, dark, fascinating world. And again, even when we look at the peaks of Tuscan communal civic culture, and definitely we will with Florence, we'll notice how these great barons stood out still, and how powerful they were actually in their respective encastellated holdings in the countryside. They also made it. This is present also in other Italian regions actually, and on the longer run, some of them would even have a revenge, even though still gravitating around the commune. But in Tuscany, you find many of these lineages maintaining that sort of martial tradition. So, as we've seen, when Matilda dies, everything falls apart. Like those bonds, like of solidarity between the same citizens of Florence did. Because they were being curtailed by, say, before it was just Matilda, now there were all these other clans, right? And so everything was much more complicated. From the outer side, there were so many different forces. Just think about, for a city, how important it is, for example, in which direction to struggle, right? The people that inhabit the city just have land on one side or the other, and waging war in that direction or not has a huge difference. So that's why you see all this factionalism over time, aside from the infiltration of the noblemen from the countryside. In any case, it's fair to see how to observe how Florence as well, like, was against, at least tendentially, the feudal families of the countryside. This is evidenced by the warring factions that the first annals of the city record as authentic history. We have to arrive to this beginning of the 12th century. Again, the Tuscan communes are, again, sort of more celebrated later in history because of their Republican attainments, and so this more popular culture would produce also more terrific historiography compared to other places. But at this point, Tuscany is less developed than Lombardy. We know more what is happening about in northern Italy than in this central part. Now, in 1107, just to talk about this wars and giving a dimension of how brutally, say, relentless they were, and how you see how immediately, just apparently from a moment to another, that is to be explained because, again, this regime changed. Matilda was not there, and all these contrasts broke out free, like it. In 1107, the Florentine forces destroyed the castle of Prato, which is a city like in the northwest of Florence, that would end up sort of cannibalized between Florence and Pistoia, is yet another city further northwest. Prato was at this point, it's a city, right? It will develop as a commune as well, but it was a stronghold at this point belonging to the Alberti count. So the Alberti would remain an important family. Now, the very important thing here is that Matilda is still alive, right? So this actually starts happening while she is sort of fading. And it's interesting because it shows how the Alberti were in control of this smaller city, still in a feudal government. What gets destroyed is actually their castle in Prato, nevertheless, right? Later, the Swabians would build a massive castle there, perhaps exactly to highlight their the reaffirmation of a feudal rule. In the same 1107, the castle of Monte Orlando, located near Lastra, Assigna, and a fief of the Adimari noble clan, allies of the Alberti, this would become, by the way, Florentine citizens themselves. Think about it. Was also attacked, right? All powerful houses that eventually tend to urbanize because they don't really have a better place where to go. Like the destruction of a castle or another didn't mean that they were done for evenly. And so rather than prolonging this agony, they said, okay, well, you know what? I will enter Florence. I will be part of the commune. I will find new places to invest in financially, and this will please the Florentines, and we will be allies. And I will become a Florentine, but never mind. We're becoming part of a bigger, more powerful thing. This did not go without bitterness, of course, but because these people were incredibly proud and violent and, incredibly unforgetful. And so you can imagine, like, I made a video about the Florentine vendetta that tells you what fundamentally the feud, like the mobster kind of mentality would remain. The radical, traumatic violence throughout all these generations. So it is. In 1110, a faction emerged in the Pesa Valley that essentially beat the Carolingi, who were likewise associates of the Alberti. So you have some general purpose that is also compacting the countryside against this pockets of nobiliary power. In 1113 and 1114, you have the first assaults launched on the castle of Montecascioli, following disputes concerning the Carolingian inheritance, a bit like the Matildine possessions on a smaller scale. And the conclusion of the last campaign marked the destruction of the castle as well as the death of the imperial vicar who defended it. Right, we are in 1119. This is also incredibly telling. This is Florence is a wealth power now. So they are openly fighting against the imperial officials that are holding there out because they were supporting these nobiliar houses that were essentially the feudal instrument that the imperial hierarchy and imperial authority had used to sustain itself in the region. So it's that visceral, it's that international, and that's messed up. Like the emperors knew what these things were happening, and they were very disconcerted, to say the least. You have 1119 is just 4 years after Matilda had been buried, right? And so it's that early, right? The earth of Tuscany is built in that much soma. This demonstrates the continuity, of course, of the Florentine political landscape as a now fully fledged sort of, as we'll see, communally evolving city. Naturally, we see, I highlighted myself this contrast, a seemingly antithetical one between the 2 years, but of course for the people living at the time, everything seemed sort of very sensible and coherent, and it was like what they did, how they thought about that, it was perfectly coherent with what they could grab, like they could mold and grow. The urban autonomies began to merge tacitly during the last decades of the 11th century. The same margravial power had not really prevented, as we explained before, the rise of other feudal clans, right? These men was seen that their possessions were very well sort of entrenched in the hinterland. There wasn't so much that even Matilda, with all her possessions, could really do. There's problems that she had also in the Po Valley, in her possessions in northern Latium, for example. The late 11th to the early 12th centuries are a period of great growth overall, and so it's as if this margravial power sort of died together with Matilda as a vestige of the past, right? And marking, in the sense, the virtual beginning of the same Florentine commune, with an evident replacement of the city's governance for the one that had come to an end. Following Matilda's wishes, which designated the church as the heir to all her possessions, Tuscany became the subject of disputed authority between the papacy and the empire further. Right, that's the enormous issue of the Matildine possessions. You know that the papacy had asked Pippin the Short, right, at Ponthion, with a little Charlemagne observing this priest, this higher priest, come from the southern lands, right, to ask for the Frankish support. And in fact, like in exchange for the royal and later imperial crown, that the latter they didn't know yet, like an enormous amount of land. Basically, the popes wanted to control the entirety of central and southern Italy, and in the north stretching up to the Adige River. This naturally never produced itself, except, of course, the Papal States would come to develop, let's say, in fact, in Latium, in Umbria, and the Marches, and in Romagna. So they later sort of expanded towards also Emilia, that direction. And the emperors naturally always contested that. They said that the papacy had in theory to mind just about the spiritual business, so those territories were not their own, and so that they had to respond to the emperor, and some would even though of course they wanted to remain autonomized. These were central Italian territories at most that were also very difficult to reach in the Apennine. They were not even particularly developed urbanly as much, at least, as Tuscany and Lombardy, of course, like a bigger civilization out there. They're very developed by European standards, but they can entrench themselves better without even being so central in the entire struggle over the kingdom of Italy. What does Matilda do? She had been contrasting imperial power, so she thinks well to donate, that knowing that she didn't have any heir, all that immense territory that basically counted like Tuscany as a whole, to this massive check of the Italic kingdom, plus other parts in the north, in Emilia, and in the mid Po Valley, to the church, like saying this is papal stuff, and this would never be resolved really as an issue. That's why the papacy and the empire struggle so much over this, because as you understand, and we've seen in other videos about Tuscan cities, we talk about Siena, for example, that was technically also to be considered as part properly of the Roman archdiocese, metropolitic possessions. This is not true for Florence and Pisa, for example. This began further south, but of course these were powerful cities, right? The papacy never had, say, the military power to enter Tuscany, for example, and that they had that, like they had massive armies under legates and whatever. But say, as we've seen just in this episode, like the sum of all the Tuscan cities was too much, right, for practically anyone, and so there wasn't much even for the emperors to make an headway in Lombardy and Tuscany, like at a prolonged level. And this is the point, like it's how these cities basically start taking control of the situation, and the ambiguity between the papacy and an empire being maintained also by this sort of third actors that are quite self-aware, quite aggressive, as we say, quite ambitious, and know how to play the game, right? Siding with the papacy or with the empire, and having all in fact different directions in this regard. You have the empire with its intermittent representatives, like actual noblemen from Germany that are the whole. We've seen it, for example, in the Duchy of Spoleto, that has a great Ghibelline continuity historically before it's absorbed by the papacy in that case. But at the end of the day, all this proving, say, imperial authority to be unable to prevent the disintegration of the Margravate of Tuscany, that in theory they had the interest of maintaining, at least under a loyal official, or to establish a consistent semblance of, say, alternative governance, right? So this is a particularly important passage in the history of the city because, you see, it's not just about Florence, right? This becomes effectively, for a long time, for a couple of centuries, a vicious, like practically a vicious struggle between the Tuscan cities themselves. I had, by the way, a video incoming about the Battle of Montaperti, which is not the usual tactical reconstruction. It's more like those videos I made on the significance, for example, of the Sunday of Bouvines, etc. Because I want to photograph these vicious local municipal rivalries that were incredibly violent. Again, I cannot stress enough how much the Italians invested in war. And when you wonder where the humanism or the Renaissance stemmed from, it stemmed from this, right? It didn't stem from some sort of contemplative, abstract, say. The Renaissance, of course, happened in a way in which say some cities had taken over, and so now it's just a courtly, say, scholar that works. But let's say the actual, like the powerful one, the sap of the great chroniclers of Dante, of the great universalistic issues, like it stems from a massive bath of blood that takes place in this sunny hills. That is a bit like the neglected part of the whole picture, and I think is actually the single most fascinating one, because as we've seen just in that 4 videos long episode about central northern Italian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century, it's insanely advanced. Like, even just from a strictly military point of view, it's incredible, and it's a mistake, in fact, to just consider the struggles as local, right? They're heavily regional and international, especially during the 13th century. But even before, as you've seen today, like this is what happens in Florence is not really random. Like you can never disjunct it from the European, like the Western European, especially. Not even like something goes far beyond with the Crusades, with the Byzantine Empire, more from the continental scale, right? And so that's why I think it's interesting. That's why I think it's always incredibly important to talk about these topics. And I'm also curious, because I know as I was saying in the beginning, I haven't made too many videos about medieval Tuscany. And we have to change that. That's why, again, I began to... Milan came out in 2 videos, right? This Florence, I will take, I don't know how much, because every century is like so loaded. I'm checking the playlist to see how much I've done. Excuse me, I drink a little. 18 videos. It's not much, because actually 5 of them are Dante's series for his 700th death anniversary. But there are some videos that are interesting, especially the ones about medieval Siena and medieval peace are very important. The Florentine vendetta as well. The rest, oh my god, we really did so few about Tuscany. You're kidding me? The hell? Well, then I'm glad we're talking this. I don't see the last video. Yes, because that's ancient history. This is medieval Tuscany. The one I made about Florence last time. Well, this will be the other book. We'll talk more about it. If you get to think it's too monothematic, I can alternate this with well, okay, you will not even notice that, but there is an Italian part of the regional cycle that I could frame at this point. For example, Southern Italian content too. Just you tell me if you prefer or not. I'm really glad, however, we're talking about this. We're talking Tuscany. We're talking about the general picture. If anything, I made lots of videos about the Italian communes in general. That is true, but I realize I have to be more specific because the beauty of the Middle Ages is really looking at, yes, things in general. If you can, you must be able to dominate them, but if you don't understand also the local history, if you don't look at every single polity step by step, it sort of doesn't make any sense. All right, it must be appreciated, and that's exactly what I'm willing to do here. Very well, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.